Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in this three-part series focused on the important role of early literacy in equity-driven teaching and learning. My name is Claire Abbott, and I'm the Director of the Office of Educator Effectiveness at the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Here at DESE, we are committed to supporting the preparation, development, and celebration of teachers and leaders who make a difference for the 1 million students in our schools. Ensuring that all of those students learn how to read, to write, and to engage with one another and with the world is central to this work and fundamental to our commitment to equity, not just equitable access to evidence-based teaching and learning, but equitable outcomes for all. As Monroe Richardson noted in the first webinar of this series, quote, "When we make connections to the consequences of not helping children reach their potential, the research clearly shows that what happens in K-3 classrooms matters a great deal. And the future of our communities and our country depends greatly on the quality of reading instruction that our children received. And this starts with the quality of preparation for reading instruction that our educators receive," unquote. So that's what we will be digging into today: how educators, schools, and systems ensure that our youngest learners are receiving evidence-based, culturally responsive, and linguistically sustaining early literacy instruction that prepares all students, particularly those from historically marginalized communities, to succeed long into the future. Culturally responsive instruction, particularly around literacy, validates and affirms students' identities by placing their customs, characteristics, experiences, and perspectives at the center of their learning. And we know from decades of research that nearly all children from every racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic background can learn to read by the end of first grade with appropriate instruction. And yet less than half of Massachusetts third graders today are meeting literacy expectations. These outcomes are even more dire for Black and Latinx students, for whom the percentage of third through fifth graders reading on grade level has dropped below 30%. This is unacceptable. Children who don't receive the support they need to be on track in grade 3 often never catch up. To achieve equitable outcomes, every student in our schools must receive the high-quality curriculum, evidence-based, and culturally responsive instruction that they need and deserve, instruction that affirms their diverse identities and cultures and values the assets that they bring to school and to the classroom. So we are working hard here in Massachusetts to set a strong foundation for instructional practices in early literacy that are evidence-based, culturally responsive, and linguistically sustaining. You can read more about the statewide Mass Literacy Initiative on our website, the link to which we will drop into the chat, as well as new expectations for early literacy instruction in teacher preparation programs that will go into effect in 2024. Momentarily, I will turn it over to an amazing panel today of national experts and literacy leaders from K-12 and educator preparation schools to dive into this topic. We are deeply honored and grateful to them for dedicating their time and their expertise. But first, I want to thank the Hunt Institute for their partnership in developing this webinar series, each of which is being recorded and will be published on our website. And I want to encourage participants to listen to the conversation as it unfolds and to share questions for our panelists using the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform. We will reserve time toward the end of the discussion to raise some of these questions for our panelists. And we may not get to every question. We will do our best to elevate as many as we can. And now I am honored to introduce the moderator for today's conversation, Dr. Nicole Harris. Dr. Harris is the Associate Dean of the McEwen School of Education at Salem State University. Her 20+ year career in education spans early childhood, elementary music education, private voice instruction, and I've heard her sing, she's amazing, college instruction, higher education administration and academic affairs, admissions and student affairs roles, and scholarship. Her research interests cover higher education institutional culture, policy, planning, and administration, particularly in relationship to issues surrounding global education, diversity, social justice, and equity initiatives. She's also a staunch advocate for evidence-based, culturally responsive literacy instruction. Welcome, Dr. Harris, and thank you for leading this important conversation.
Thank you so very much, Claire. I appreciate that generous introduction. Good afternoon, colleagues, panel members, sponsors, and guests. It is an honor to be here with you today to facilitate this critical conversation. Over the past 10 years, the Commonwealth has seen a 34.3% increase in the number of BIPOC identified school-age learners. This astonishing growth rate, increasing year over year, is coupled with deep concerns about continued disparate educational experiences and outcomes for our marginalized communities. Immediate commitment and investment is required to ensure that students are feeling affirmed in their classrooms and validated in our classroom communities. So I really appreciate Claire's emphasizing that we need to focus on the assets that students are bringing to the classroom as cultural and well-rounded beings, which is critical to the long-term success of our communities. Thus, today we will be focusing on the ways that the consistent application of evidence-based literacy practices together with high-quality instructional materials that are aligned with culturally sustaining and responsive best practices can support the addressing of the opportunity gap, if you will, which Dr. Ladson-Billings brought to the fore many years ago for our youngest and often most marginalized literacy learners. So hopefully today's child-centered discussion is really the beginning of an ongoing and sustained conversation leading to action and change. So for those of you who really enjoy using social media, we do encourage you to live tweet or to post about today's session online, and you can use the hashtag MACRP So I'll make sure that that information is available for the group to be able to use. Once again, today we have two objectives: to explore the relationship between effective literacy instruction and culturally responsive practice by articulating the belief that you cannot have one without the other. And the second is to underscore the importance of curricular literacy and HQIM, and this is definitely an area where we can grow. So I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists. So we'll start with Africa Afeni-Mills. She is an education consultant, an adjunct instructor, and the author of Open Windows, Open Minds, Developing Anti-Racist, Pro-Human Students. A former teacher and literacy coach from Massachusetts, she currently works with colleagues, teachers, coaches, and administrators to transform instructional practices. Ms. Mills believes that all educators can be motivated, engaged, dynamic practitioners, and leaders when provided with the support that they need to create student-centered, culturally responsive learning environments. Our second panelist today is Dr. Tracy White-Whedon, who is the president and CEO of Newhouse Education Center. During her tenure in this role, Dr. Whedon has expanded the reach and impact of NEC from a local nonprofit to a broader impact across the state of Texas and on a national and international level. Prior to serving at NEC, Dr. Whedon was the Executive Director of Academic Planning for Scholastic Achievement Partners. She also spent 5 years as the Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum, Instruction, and Assessment for Houston School District. And her life's work has been to position literacy success for all as a moral imperative that creates a place at the table for every child and adult, regardless of the zip code or country of origin. And our third panelist is Ashley Clerget, a 5th grade humanities teacher at the Hugh Rowe O'Donnell Elementary School in Boston, a 2021 Massachusetts Teacher of the Year semifinalist, and a former Optic Content Fellow and Inspired Fellow at DESE. This past February, the International Literacy Association named Ashley in their 30 under 30 list, recognizing her as an energetic literacy champion who is dedicated to helping her students discover the transformative power of reading and writing. She is a passionate advocate for educators' continuous growth and learning in culturally and linguistically responsive instruction so that they are able to foster students' critical thinking, activism, and self-awareness. I'm so excited to have each and every one of you here today. And so I really would like to start today's discussion by asking each of you the same question. I'd like to hear your perspective and description of what culturally responsive teaching in early literacy looks like in practice. Why don't we start with Erica Afeni-Mills? Ms. Mills?
Thank you so much. So, it's so hard to narrow it down, but I'm trying to think about the thing that comes to top of mind for me is really capitalizing on families as students' first teachers. I think a lot of times we come into I'll speak for myself. Coming into the classroom when I was a classroom teacher, I thought a lot about, okay, well, here are the standards that I need to address, and here's the content that I need to teach. And I had heard, like, I know the students are not really empty slates, but at the same time, I think a lot of times we can think from a deficit-based perspective about students, not because we mean to, but because we think about like what we need to do for students without necessarily focusing on what they're already coming in with, the richness that they bring from themselves and their families and community. So I think honestly, it's really like not just paying lip service to partnering with families, but genuinely doing that and just being really curious about what literacies students already come into the classroom learning space with, because they don't come in empty, they come in with so much, and we should be continuing the learning that they've already began at home. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I'll take it over to Dr. Whedon. Again, the question, what does culturally responsive teaching in early literacy look like in practice?
Well, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge Africa's a really important point. It's about partnership. The very first and most important teacher our children have are mom, dad, grandma, whoever's rearing them at home. And you're so right. They don't come to us as a blank slate. They come to us as unique masterpieces with lived experiences that are relevant. And so this work is about having a theory of action, not a band-aid, not something we do and check a box. Culturally relevant instruction looks at the assets the student brings to this classroom and maximizes and leverage those assets so that they can be invited into rigorous and relevant instruction that prepares them for their place in a knowledge economy and an information age, regardless of zip code, regardless of student group. And so in this multicultural society, with all of these complex problems, we need all of our children to help us move into solutions and a better quality of life for everyone.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Dr. Whedon. I'm going to allow Ashley Cleget, our teacher on the panel here today, active teacher. Why don't you answer the question for us? What do you think that culturally responsive teaching in early literacy looks like in practice?
Yes, and before I start, I just wanted to echo all of the sentiments of the panelists before me who brought really important and necessary points. And I just wanted to add, some of my thoughts that I was thinking. Because a lot of the time when we think of culturally responsive practice, especially in early literacy in the early grades, we tend to default our thinking to just inclusive literature. Like, don't get me wrong, it's absolutely critical and immensely important. However, culturally responsive teaching goes beyond just having a character of color in a book. It consists of questioning. How are you developing self-love and a healthy self-image for students? How are you using literacy as identity development? What does your pedagogy look like? Does it include teaching in a way that integrates cultural practices from your students' background, which adds on to this idea of partnerships with family members and community members as well. Also, early literacy is a lot more than just letter identification, CVC decoding, and phonological awareness. A crucial part of early literacy that many schools tend to cut down on in order to adapt to, better said, the white supremacist work culture of education is taking out opportunities for oral language development, like play. And in my personal practice, students that come from classrooms where they don't get much play and talk time in class later struggle with expanding their thinking in writing, reading comprehension, and critical thinking skills. So for me, knowing your students really well, combating white supremacy culture, and including culturally sustaining practices is key.
What I really appreciate about the way that you all have defined culturally responsive practice in early literacy, you've talked about it in a much more expansive way, not just about what it is that we're giving the student, not just what it is about trying to create a cookie cutter student that meets some standard, but thinking about the ways that the child and their families are part of a larger community and that that's meaningful. And I really appreciate that. I think it's a really good segue into my next question, which I'll take over to Ms. Mills. In your book, Open Windows, Open Minds, you talk a lot about how to equip students so that they can look at themselves in the mirror and to discover what lies beyond the familiar through windows so that they can effectively make meaning of the world around them. And so in addition to preparing teacher candidates to celebrate and affirm the diversity of our students through cultural representation, what are some other key practices and instructional strategies of effective literacy instruction that are culturally and linguistically sustaining do you recommend?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. So I think in a lot of ways, when I think back to my own preparation as a teacher in my teacher ed program, I was like, oh, I want to be a teacher because my fourth and fifth grade teachers were so amazing. And that's the grade I want to teach. And so you get really excited and you're learning from your methods classes, you're thinking about your own education. But I think once you hit the ground running, once you are in your classroom and beginning to practice, it can be so easy to lose sight of the things that have influenced what we esteem when it comes to literacy. So for the first thing that I think about is being aware what has shaped our own literacy identities. I know the work of Alfred Tatum, he talks about textual lineages. And so I honestly think it's really important for us to be aware of like what has shaped us, because by default, whether we like it or not, we are very influenced in the way that we engage our students with content in the ways that we were shaped. If they were great, that's wonderful. If they were not so inclusive, then that's not so great for our students. So really doing the work to be aware of what shapes like what we esteem as valuable when it comes to literacy, right? So I think that's one of the first things, is to do our self-work. And then from there, we can begin to really think about, well, okay, well, what does that mean? What do we want to model for students? What do we want to esteem and to elevate and to prioritize in our literacy instruction? And I think that it really, we only able to do that when we do that self-work first. And so the other piece too is I think about, it's like we were already talking about, is that when we think about literacy, I think if anyone's like me, my immediate thought goes to reading, but it's not just reading, it's about writing as well. And so I think it's really important for us to be aware of, when we're talking about identity being important and cultural identity and ethnic identity being important, we need to think about what we're preparing the students with. So for example, if they're in a classroom, in addition to play and how they get to build their, like how they're engaging with one another, how are they representing themselves on the page when they're having an opportunity to do self-portraits? Do they actually have crayons that represent all the different skin tones and the ways that we show up in the beauty of ourselves, right? And the different ways that we represent ourselves, is to make sure that when students are beginning to write, that they can represent not only what they look like authentically, but also what the world looks like as they're getting to connect with other people. And I think the other piece too is that as we do that, we get to help them to see themselves as contributors to literacy and not just consumers. So we're helping them to build their contribution, which can therefore make what we're engaging students with even more rich for one another, so that they have the opportunity to both see themselves represented in mirrors and to discover, what lies beyond that through the windows into other people's lives and experiences. So those are some of the first things that come to mind for me. And I think, like, going back to my first comment too, is just really thinking about, I think it's an often overlooked, like, just wealth of opportunity to engage with family members and community members. And so one of the things we talked about is like not only culture, but language. How amazing would it be if we had families coming in and reading with students, and not only reading with students in English and not going through this, I think a lot of times we still do prioritize English by talking about other, like, English as, as a second language. I think we've started to come away from that phrasing, but even too, it's like, okay, we're talking about English and other languages as like rich and beautiful, and bringing families in to share that with the community and to learn from it, and to invite students languages that they have, that they know too, into the space as part of the literary experience. And so those are some of the things I think about that I think we often acknowledge, but don't necessarily practice in our literacy instruction.
I appreciate that, because the point you're making about the self-authorship and the ability for children to be able to bring their full selves forward. It's like we sometimes believe that we're just putting information into an empty box, but we forget that they need to express themselves first, and it's through that leveraging that we can actually help them to think about how to do it effectively. I appreciate that. And I think one challenge that we have that I appreciated that you said is that sometimes there's so many things on our plate. There's so many things that we have to do, so many rules we have to follow. We're coming with our own preconceived ideas. And so there's all kinds of structural things that sometimes get in the way, if you will, of really fully allowing ourselves to realize the opportunities for our students. And I think that's a really good segue to Dr. Whedon. And I'm hopeful that you can talk a little bit about your work as well. After all, you've spent your career building programs and systems that advance literacy and academic excellence. So from your perspective, What are some of the systems or policies that need to be in place to ensure that educators are well prepared, both in like the content knowledge that's needed to teach evidence-based literacy skills, as well as the cultural competence that supports valuing and celebrating all students? What do we lose if educators aren't prepared to do both?
Powerful question. So linking this to systems, often are tied to laws, and you've seen quite a few state laws established. Here's the thing, friends. There's the letter of the law, and then there's the spirit of the law. And the spirit of the law, educators are equipped for the right word, breathe life into the intention. Or they cross their arms and they hope that this too shall pass. Well, our country is becoming increasingly diverse, so this too shall not pass. And we need to ensure that we're bringing honor to the profession by equipping educators pre-service, not just waiting until they're in service, with the right mental model, with the right theory of action. Back to that idea of a theory of action tied to systems work. So this work starts with a high level of vulnerability. We have all inherited systemic, racist, and classist systems. We didn't sign up for it. It is what it is. And we need every literacy ally involved in transparently and authentically and vulnerably saying, how have I been a part of either dismantling a system that is not working well for certain students or perpetuating the system? I really want to talk about what Ashley talked about, and that is the oral language piece. That's an asset. So it starts with understanding how we frame that learner. Let's say they come to us and they have AAE as a dialect. Is that a high prestige dialect? How is it perceived? And so we have to be honest with ourselves about how we perceive it, and then how do we frame or narrate that student's lived experience and the parent, who, by the way, the system may have also failed. So we have to look at the data, and the data doesn't lie. And I'm not just talking about a minimum standard state test. I'm talking about NAEP. I'm talking about PISA. If we're going to be an internationally competitive country, we cannot fail our Black and brown children. And they must see themselves as having a place at the table. And one of the things I would say in terms of framing this work is there is cognitive science that tells us how this brain is wired, and it's wired via culture. And so we want to equip educators who are preparing for the work to understand that upstream dynamic. Okay, how do I help that child understand how they're wired, how to build upon the currency they bring? And I call literacy a form of currency. It's how we read, speak, and write. And so the phrase I use often, and I say this is a relative term. We want children to be able to read in the language of power, write in the language of power, and express their ideas in the language of power. When I go to inner city Detroit, where I grew up, that currency is a different pocket I pull. And it's just as relevant, it's relational, it's valuable. I'm not giving my currency away. But when I go into a boardroom, I can reach into the other pocket and I can pull that out as well. And so we want our children to come in with a double fist of currency where they can say, I belong in any room I'm in. And so it starts with the State Department and the why. This is the area I find we do the least work on, establishing the why and communicating that strategically to our students who are consumers of their own learning. They need to understand this is a knowledge economy and information age we're preparing you for. We're not preparing you for a minimum standards test. We're preparing you to be literate for life. So you can look, as we heard, into the windows, into the mirror as you choose to. So this means aligning all tiers of instruction around what is evidence-driven, evidence-based, and not ignoring that core thread. If we think about the reading rope, right? That is who they are and what they bring to the table. That's always a part of them. So do you know what you bring as an educator? Do you know how to celebrate and accept that? And do you know how to help children recognize and celebrate that and add those two currencies together to create something even more powerful? And so we've got to work that plan and plan the work, but the why needs to be the driver, because that's our anchor that keeps us in the right work.
I think the metaphor of currency is really powerful right now, because when we think about the socio-political implications of language, of reading, all of those things, I think it's very easy when we've already adapted to the language and of power in our workspaces, we forget our own journeys that we've gone through, or we may not be aware of the journey that our students have to go through. And what does that mean for us? And I think that connects all the way back to doing the work as educators in terms of our perspective on how we evaluate the ways in which our students that's what they bring to the classroom, what that looks like in the class. So I really, really appreciate that. I think it's also helpful and useful for us to be thinking about how it is that teachers come by the knowledge to be able to actually do that. And so I think that's a perfect segue to Ashley. I'm hoping that you can tell us a little bit about your story. You know, there can often be this lack of professional development and learning around culturally and linguistically sustaining literacy instruction that exists within educator preparation programs. What personal learning and development did you seek out in order to feel like you could adequately be prepared for the student populations that you serve?
Thanks. This is such a great question, and one that I do love to talk about extensively. And it does rest a lot in culture, which Dr. Whedon just beautifully explained to us. And first, it was really important for me to understand how culture impacts learning, because the research is there. What you need to do that is research aligned. The science of reading is there. It is very easy to come by, but how do you integrate culturally responsive practices? That was my first big question mark when it came to doing this work. So I started around my second year of teaching when I started reading the Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome book by Dr. Joy DeGruy. And even though it wasn't directly related to teaching, there were a lot of points made in the book that had me saying, yes, I get it. Finally, I get it. But one part particularly that stuck out to me and still sticks out to me was when she outlined this point of authenticity, how in white culture, two colleagues could hate each other, but they would still go out for lunches together, go golfing, etc. However, in Black culture, that sort of authenticity is very valued. So, it feels somewhat impossible to carry on an interpersonal relationship conversation with somebody that you strongly dislike. And I found myself relating a lot, especially as a Black educator. And I found that as a pain point within myself trying to navigate white supremacist work culture. And then it dawned on me that this is probably what my students are experiencing, this cultural clash in the classroom. And I couldn't help but want to learn more, because if I was feeling this cultural clash as a staff member, how were students experiencing that in my classroom? And from there, I had to interrogate my own pedagogical practices. I've never attended a PD that actually, would do this work, because it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of putting this as a priority. So I had to interrogate and question myself, how did my interpretation of grade level work clash with culture? Could something I thought was neutral, like for example, linguistics interplaying with writing instruction, could that be a clash of cultures? And the answer for all of those questions was yes. And I was lucky in a sense that my home culture matched many of my students, so I was able to use my personal knowledge as a frame of reference. But for the cultures I wasn't a part of, I had to do the work, and I had to learn the history from those areas. I had to understand the culture. I had to understand their cultural traditions. I had to understand their cultural systems of operating. And once I understood culture, I could use that with the research in different areas of pedagogy, content, and instruction to help check for areas where I was either enabling white supremacy or dismantling it in my practice. And essentially, this constant interrogation and this constant putting culture over curriculum sometimes in order to make sure that the curriculum is being received by students creates this third stage that I strive for, and I hope that all educators strive for, where the classroom becomes a bridge between the home life and the very racist, structurally racist educational system. And our third stage is a place where students can tinker with academia and own it and navigate it. And, it needs to be a safe space where students feel like they could bring themselves and bring their mistakes, or just bring their difference, their different way of approaching writing or talking or speaking, and see how it aligns to what Dr. Whedon referred to as that language of power.
Ashley, that was a really powerful response. And the thing that's really resonating with me right now is that, children are in the classroom and they are negotiating power, whether we realize it or not. So acknowledging that they are in that power negotiation, and that part of our responsibility is to understand that there are times when we have to center the culture over the content because it actually advances the overall goal. That's really tough to hear, right? That's really tough when there's so much content to do. There's so much we need to get to. What about the test scores? What about the outcomes? And we see over and over again that the highest performing schools that have BIPOC identified pupils doing well, it's because they've centered the culture first and allowed students to bring who they are forward. And the second thing you said that's really resonating right now is the fact that to do the work, especially for cultures that we don't belong to, right, personally, it's an opportunity to link what Dr. Whedon and Dr. Ms. Mills mentioned, which is really engaging the families, because that's the only way to get to know that, right? Dr. Whedon, did you want to add something?
I do. I believe that with all my heart. And one of the researchers I just highly esteem is Dr. Karen Mapp, MAPP, out of Harvard University. Got to do some work with her in Florida, and she has a dual capacity framework to allow a teacher, a principal, a district to calibrate for how they are engaging families in a way that's respectful and ties their students' growth. It's not about just this test, it's about their growth on their journey and understanding how they are growing, right? She's amazing. Another thought leader I love is Dr. Zaretta Hammond. And her work and her theory of action is so powerful in framing that learning partnership piece. So we do have structures we can learn from that researchers have established. You don't have to make the wheel all over again. You get to go and dig in and look at what can I apply tomorrow, whether it's my own personal awareness or it's that partnership piece, whether it's engaging the community or whether it's information processing with the goal of students owning their own ability to think critically and continue to add to their backpack all the information they want, because this is, it's about what you can do with information now. It's, it used to be Encyclopedia Britannica on a shelf. Now you Google, right? And you have to discern what's true and what's not so close to the truth and all of that. The other thing I want to say is positioning this in a way that acknowledges the structural apartheid that these systems have created. We cannot ignore that because we can only move at the speed of trust. And I know as a classroom teacher, Ashley, you know what I mean. You got to when you earn the trust of the students, they're going to do backflips with you. They're going to do whatever. We got to earn the trust of the parents, of the children, and of our community. And if we don't acknowledge the visceral pain systemic racism and classism has created, that's the white elephant in the front room. But how to do that? Who teaches us how to do that? We need to learn how to do that work. Because if you look at South Africa, Desmond Tutu talks about that as one of the upstream issues. You've got to be able to have some reconciliation work and acknowledge what happened. You don't wallow in it. You don't admire the problem. You acknowledge it, and then you say, what's next? That's part of systems change.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate your pointing out again, you're pointing out the power piece. The students and their families already perceive the power differential. And if we ignore it and pretend it's not there, then they're not going to trust. They just see, here's another example of this being imposed upon me. And then you will experience resistance. And so I love the way you frame the trust. So that really, I think, leads me to a question I'm curious to know if anyone in the panel wants to take on. What is it that educators need to consider as they try to approach sort of evidence-based literacy instruction in order to acknowledge and honor students' diverse linguistic, their cultural experiences, the power dynamics you all have talked about. What is it that educators need to be thoughtful or aware of? Anyone want to take that first? Ms.
I'll
Mills?
take it on. I'll take it on. Yeah. So I think, I'm going to start by saying that I'm not saying that this is easy. So let's get that already established. I think in a lot of ways, when it comes to education, when it comes, let me start like actually apart from education. When we think about other things, I'm not a gardener. I don't do well with plants, but I know like when we're thinking about growing something, we know that the soil has to be healthy. We know that there needs to be time for a root system to develop, and we need to make sure that there's a firm foundation before something grows. However, when it comes to education, I think we're really looking for some quick fixes. We can't do it like that. This is not a microwave approach. This is a crock pot, right? And so I think the main thing we need to be thinking about is that this is not something that we're going to be like, try this strategy and then this will be fixed. We shouldn't be thinking about children or their families or the communities as something to be fixed in the first place. It's really about thinking about like, we really need to get back to, well, not even back to, because a lot of us haven't even had this foundational learning. We need to be able to get the learning that we need to be able to teach in a way that is culturally responsive and sustaining. That means we have to like break up some hardened ground. We need to be able to get that soil healthy. We need to be able to plant things and to nurture it and to give it time to grow. I think a lot of times the hurry with which we try to approach things is a big enemy to our being able to see children for who they are and their families and communities. We can't really rush this. This is something that we really need time to freedom dream and build, like we're dismantling and building at the same time. So I think that's the main thing too, is that we really need to think about like not trying to rush this, because this system of oppression and let's talk about like academic apartheid, all these different things have taken hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to establish. It's not going to be repaired immediately, but with intention we can begin to move in a different direction, but we can't try to rush it and then say, see, it's not working. It's like, no, well, you're trying to rush it. Like, you're not going to get the outcome right away. You need to be able to invest in it. That's the way investment works, right? And so just really wanted to talk about that. We need to slow down and to really spend the time that we need to make sure we're doing what we need to do by children.
I appreciate that, because I often in DEI spaces am asked for a toolkit. Give me a toolkit and I'll just apply, item 4, 5, and 8. And my brown students will automatically start performing at where my other students are. And I think that's really important, because it means the whole concept of dismantling is taking something apart and doing it completely differently. So I really appreciate the time piece. Dr. Whedon?
I want to call something out, and it's not going to be comfortable for some people to hear this, but I'm just going to call it out. And that is, in some systems, the children look like the children we're describing who need to be honored in their scholarship, and they are perpetuating the systems. It's not about this. Leadership is about disposition, not position and title. And just because I'm a Black person and shows up in a school with a critical mass of Black students doesn't mean I understand how to do this work. So this is a all hands on deck. This is white allies, every ally. And multilingualism and language variety is something we put up front. We don't tag it on later. I don't care if you're white, Black, or polka dot. If you love children and you want to fight for those vulnerable babies who've been falling through the cracks, I want to work with you. And I think this is a part of the work too, is we all have work to do. I have work to do. I heard that phrase. We need to do our work, right? So that work starts at the State Department level and actually at the national level. What's the national narrative about the why and the what? And that should be coherent at the State Department level, and that coherence needs to carry all the way through. However, I would add, it's so important to celebrate and acknowledge the models that universities are embracing that are actually working. People need a mental model to know what it looks like. And there are professors who are not Ivy Tower professors. They're boots on the ground in the middle of the work, right? They're not pontificating, sage on the stage. They're in the trenches. They're doing the real work. Who are those professors? Where are those lighthouse university programs that we can elevate to make the case that other people can also do the right work and prevent educator failure? If we don't prevent educator failure, we cannot prevent student failure. If we elevate our work and learn from this COVID chrysalis in particular, this is the moment to seize to reinvent. This is the time to come out of this chrysalis with a brand new, big, bold vision that we can all move towards, because there's just so much discord, and we are going to rise together or not. And we're going to rise. We're at a critical juncture, and this is the tipping point. I just feel in my spirit, I don't know if you feel it too, but I feel like we're in that moment where if we get a critical mass of people moving forward with the right intentions, we can do something pretty dynamic in our country.
I really think it's powerful that you talked about preventing the failure of the educators as well, right? Because it's tied to the success of the students. So with that in mind, like, what is it that you think that you mentioned colleges and universities and that there are some good models there? So since many colleges and universities have educator preparation programs, although there are other types of organizations that do as well, what do you think that educator preparation programs can do to ensure that pre-service teachers are coming in with the disposition necessary to be able to begin the lifelong work of implementing culturally responsive practices in the classroom, not just day one, but from day one and beyond? Any thoughts about that? Sorry, Dr. Wheaton.
I'd love to jump in on that. Okay, so first of all, are they asking districts what they need to prepare their children for a knowledge economy and an information age? Have they been preparing educators, not just teachers, but superintendents and principals and central office leaders who know how to do this work well, whether it's the science, the cultural responsive pieces, and how they weave together? Are they being apprenticed to scale this work responsibly and sustainably? If you're not asking the question, do you really want to know? Do you really have a mission to set educators up for success? Because if you think about, I think about all the money that I invested as a first-gen college graduate in my future, and to leave ill-prepared for the right work is another way of perpetuating the systemic dysfunction. So we're either about dismantling systemic dysfunction or feeding it at the table and saying, have another bite. So I would say we got to think not just about the teacher, because teachers, God bless you, teachers out there. You get blamed for every ill of society. And we have to make sure that all levels in a system are coherent to support that teacher at the most important job in this country.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to weigh in? Ashley, what do you think? What are some things that you, as a teacher, if you look back, what are things that you think educator preparation programs could be doing to prepare teacher candidates to embark on the journey that you've been embarking on?
My answer is a bit controversial, but I do think that educator preparation programs should base their instructional practices in some sort of critical theory. It doesn't have to be critical race theory, but it should be something. What lens do educator prep programs want their students, their graduates, to critically consume and adapt curricula and pedagogy with? Is it racial identity development theory? Is it targeted universalism? Is it racial capitalism theory? I think it's really critical that educator preparation programs think deeply about how they want their graduates to approach education when they're out in the field and work backwards from there.
I appreciate that. Ms. Mills, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I do. I mean, absolutely co-sign on everything that has already been said. And then also, I think, and I mean, there's so much that would need to be done differently, but I really think it's important, especially in the work that I've gotten to do with educators in the past, probably about 2 to 3 years, when I'm talking in particular with white identifying educators. And I think it's important for us to be able to name that when we're looking at the racial identity of the majority of teachers in this country, they're over 80% white, mostly white women. One of the things I see pretty often when folks are at the beginning of their journey of thinking of learning about what it means to be culturally responsive and sustaining is, oh, we have to do better by Black and brown people. And I'm not saying that that isn't true. It's also problematic, though, in some ways, if folks are just like, okay, well, Black and brown folks have been treated so poorly and it's really been awful, and we got to do better for them. I'm like, well, you too, as a part of the member of the human family, racism and racialization is destructive to all of us. Now it has disparate ways that it shows up, but it's like, it's not about just trying to help Black and brown kids and folks in Black and brown communities, because there are reasons why, systemic reasons why things have happened the way they have. And just thinking about really think about the impact that it's had on you as a white identifying person, to be told that, your way of being or seeing the world is normal and everybody else's is other, right? Or that, because I think that that's what ends up being at the foundation of like white saviorism. And we don't need that, right? Like, we all need to be working together to make sure the whole human family is doing well and thriving. And so I just really think too, as far as like ed prep programs, is really being able to think about like taking an honest look at race and racialization and the social construct of it and where it began, and how we're going to intentionally dismantle that and then build something better. I think we have to be explicit about that. We can't hope that people just, come by that understanding on their own. It's really critical at that foundational level.
I appreciate that. And I think, this whole conversation, right, which is trying to figure out how to do that well, is important. We have a question from someone here that's an attendee who poses a question about the concern that the conversation around the discourse around science of reading creates a situation where Black and brown children are positioned as, needing to focus only on the foundational skill, to the exclusion of dealing with the cultural and the humanity pieces. And so the question really is about how we should be talking about and framing evidence-based literacy instruction in the context of culturally responsive practices, so that we can help our students to be successful, but also to create the right language and the right discourse and the right practices that we need to foster. Dr. Whedon?
I would love to jump into that one. So if you're ever in Houston, I invite you to come to our building where we have adult literacy classes. And we have from 16 to an 88-year-old learning to read for the first time. I consider adult literacy to be the canary in the mine. And if I had the time to unpack the data, it would blow your mind. How many adults in our country are functionally illiterate or struggling with literacy? In Houston, where I live, 1 in 3. 1 in 3 are struggling with literacy. So this 88-year-old had the goal of reading Christmas books and stories to his grandchildren, and he achieved that goal. Think about 88 years of struggling to survive because you do not have functional literacy skills. So I would ask you, regardless of the suit you were sent here in, to think about your literacy privilege. I have literacy privilege. And you better believe my 3 children have access to that literacy privilege. And because of that, they have completely different life outcomes than my parents, who navigated the war zone of poverty and extreme poverty, passed enough currency for me to take it to the next level. And now I'm expecting them to take it to another one and pay that literacy privilege forward. So we all agree that literacy is a form of privilege. And if we do, and I can't wait to hear what Ashley has to say. Yes, science of reading. It's not just about foundational skills. It's about unpacking the structure of the language in all aspects of the language, including writing. If you can't decode, you're not going to get to writing. If you cannot speak in a way to express your ideas effectively, you're lacking a piece of the currency of the 21st century. And so we're backloading with the science of reading and how the brain is wired with the idea of prevention, not just intervention. The prevention piece is a critical piece because it's estimated around 15% of the people in the world are dyslexic. And if you visit a maximum security prison in your community, I can guarantee you around 48 to 50% of those inmates are dyslexic. If you can afford dyslexia therapy, your kid's going to be okay. But if you can't, the pipeline to prison's jaws are open and waiting and yawning for those children. This is super high stakes. And so it's, again, the narrative around this is it's prevention, but there's no ceiling on unpacking the potential of a child. If this child is still learning to decode and they're in 3rd grade and they can't, then that's just malpractice. So it's about becoming diagnostic and prescriptive in your practice. Build your knowledge so that knowledge does matter, because the kid can decode and build the language in a way that moves them forward.
Thank you. Ashley, would you like to
Yeah, sure. I would love to add on and just like emphasize that a lot of this planning for culturally responsive instruction happens in intellectually prepping for lessons. So I will always use something that is research backed because it is so important to give kids access to that. And if kids do not have access to decodable text, at the younger ages, or science-backed ways to instruct in literacy, then you are not giving kids opportunities they deserve, and it's creating that educational apartheid that we did talk about. So when I am intellectually prepping for a lesson, there are a few things that I think about. The first thing I think about is the text that I'm using, a window or a mirror into a culture or identity. If it is a mirror for my students, how am I structuring the lesson so that content is empowering? And or it gives students an opportunity to bring themselves and their experiences to the table. If the text is a window, how am I teaching the text in a way that builds solidarity between identities? And a second thing that I think about are what questions and activities can I add for criticality? How can I give students an opportunity to use our text to critique a system at large? Now, a lot of people might say that in the early grades, and especially because we're talking about early literacy, that this sort of work is completely impossible. But I would argue against that notion, just because young kids have a really strong sense of justice and an idea of what is fair and right and wrong, and should be given an opportunity to explore that thinking through books. And criticality can also come as a form of positive identity development and using literature to build up our kids, which directly challenges white supremacy. And then the last thing I think about, especially in my context, my school receives one of the highest percentages of newcomer students to the country. So I have a lot of English learners. And when I'm thinking about instructing on a new skill, like for example, writing, I'm thinking about, are there ways where I am actively stamping out their home culture in my instruction? For example, how am I building writing skills while also respecting and honoring and refining the linguistic patterns of the home languages to craft their writing? Just because the way that you write in Spanish, the way that arguments are formed in Spanish, for example, majority of my students are Spanish speakers, is very different from English. In English, we get straight to the point. In Spanish, it tends to have a more flowery sort of writing before the argument begins. And a lot of the times in English dominant classrooms, a student who comes from a Spanish speaking household will have that essay torn up and just saying, you're talking too much in your essay, or you're writing too much, or you're talking in circles. And it's important to respect the way that students are thinking and verbalizing their responses to literature, and to also help integrate it into this idea of the power, the language of power. So that's how I approach it in my classroom.
So we are getting really close to time, and we have just dozens and dozens of amazing questions, and I couldn't ask them all. But I do have one more that I would like to, and I was hoping that everyone could give a succinct kind of response that might be useful. We've tried to synthesize several questions together with this final one, which is that there are many educators who are working hard from the grassroots level to make change in their districts, to start trying to do the work that we're talking about. But many of them are experiencing some challenges as they try to work upwards. And so just in a brief statement or two, could you just describe how we could support educators at the systems level who, in order to successfully prioritize culturally and linguistic pedagogy in early literacy? Any thoughts about how we can
I'll
support?
jump in first, and I'll try to be succinct. I know I can be a bit verbose, so here we go. Um, I want to say that you've got to find your village. You may remember the story Stone Soup when you were a kid, one of my favorite books. And the villagers were very unfriendly and uninviting, but they created a vision that was so compelling that they changed the whole climate around them. You start changing the climate with being excellent in your work. And if it's unappreciated, make sure you're going to conferences, make sure you're taking advantage of every experience online, build your village. You will rise. Do not waste and squander your special gifts on systems that are not going to support your growth. Find the systems that will, and go plug into those. Shake the dust off your feet and keep walking. Because when you combine forces with people who are going to be your iron sharpening iron, you're going to get better and better at your craft. So you've got to find your village, you got to find your people, and be on that trajectory of growth with those individuals. So don't feel guilty. I believe you each have unique gifts and abilities, and they should not be squandered in systems that are dysfunctional.
Thank you. I'm afraid that'll have to be our last word. I just wanted to say thank you so much to Ms. Mills, Dr. Whedon, Ms. Clerget. All that you've shared today has been very enlightening, and I see a sentiment in the Commons Q&A about what an amazing panel you all have formed today, and we could probably talk about this for hours. So with that, I just want to say thank you again. Thank you to all the attendees. It has been an honor to facilitate, and I'll pass it back to Claire Abbott from DESE.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Harris, for leading this conversation. And our enormous gratitude to all of the panelists, Africa Afeni Mills, Tracy White Whedon, and Ashley Clerget, for sharing your time, your expertise, and your experiences with us today. I believe that you just work so well to lift up both students and teachers, and to really set a goal for all of us as a state moving forward in a way that can really change lives, starting from those kindergartners and first graders. So thank you so much. We have one more opportunity to come together next Monday to discuss early literacy with multilingual learners. And there were several questions in the Q&A about what this looks like in classrooms with multilingual learners. And we have a terrific panel ready to go next week. Dr. Claudia Rinaldi from LaSalle University will lead this final conversation around early literacy instruction with multilingual learners, with panelists including Dr. Claude Goldenberg, Dr. Christina Buddy, and Massachusetts teacher Mandy Hollister. So I think we're placing a link in the chat to register for this webinar, and I hope everybody can join us for that conversation as well. So thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Take care.